Hi Blender heads, Jamie here from Dragon Boot Studios. I have another speed sculpt for you today, and it's one of my all-time favourite Pokemon, and one I've really wanted to tackle for a long time, Lapras. So this video, unlike some of my previous ones, is just going to cover the sculpting process. So I'm planning on there being part 2, where I'll go through texturing and extracting all of this sculpted detail to displacement maps and normal maps, etc. And then probably a third part where I'll cover rigging and rendering. So you probably saw right at the very beginning there, I kind of created this 2D plane and just sort of was lining it up. I was doing that to double check that my reference images were matching up. So I kind of take that plane and I put it at the top of the head and the eyes and around the belly just to make sure that everything is lining up. I kind of had a little bit of that problem when I did the Spyro sculpt where things didn't line up perfectly, caused me a little bit of trouble later on. Now I've seen a lot of people, particularly the last couple of weeks on the Facebook groups and the Blender forums, and they're asking the same question, should I learn modeling or sculpting? And I wanted to take this video to kind of discuss a little bit of the differences. There's a couple of different ways that you can answer this question, and the answer that's most relevant to you is going to depend whereabouts you are in your artistic journey. One answer is, it doesn't really matter. So traditional polygon modeling and sculpting, they're just two different tools that essentially do the same job. So pick one. Pick whichever one you feel most comfortable with, and just practice that, at least to start with. Another way of answering it as, and this is for those that are kind of slightly further along their journey, is, well, it depends. And it usually depends on what kind of character you're trying to make. So here, Lapras here, is a fairly simple character, and by that I mean it's made up of fairly simple shapes. So, you know, the body is basically just a stretched out sphere, the flippers are also just kind of flattened spheres, the tail is a tapered cylinder, the neck is just a cylinder, the head is a sphere and there's a little cylinder coming out of it to make the horn, the shell is kind of much the same, it's a half sphere with lots of cylinders coming out of it. So once you train your eye to see all these kind of basic shapes, you can start to see what the topology underneath it should look like. So polygon modeling becomes fairly straightforward. On the other hand, if you've got a more complicated character like, let's say, the Hulk from Avengers, he's got a lot of stuff going on, like, you know, defined muscles and wrinkles, fat, well, probably not so much fat with the Hulk, but he's got a lot of high resolution detail there. So it's much, much harder to just kind of look at him and guess what the topology should be. A character like the Hulk, you would probably go in and sculpt it. Also, sculpting is much faster for adding like these high frequency details like wrinkles and skin pores. I mean, it's technically possible to do them with polygon modeling, but it takes a lot longer. So as you start to get better at both sculpting and polygon modeling, you'll start to choose which tool you want to use depending on the complexity of your character. And the final answer, and the one that I kind of wanted to demonstrate in this video, is why not both? So at the end of the day, modeling and sculpting are two different but very similar tools for accomplishing the same task, and there's no reason that you can't kind of switch back and forth between the two. So in this video, you've probably already seen that I started with polygon modeling with just like spheres and cylinders, but as the model's grown more complex, I jump more and more into the sculpt mode so that I can make kind of more large scale changes. So this is really helpful because there comes a point where the model is detailed enough that you don't want to be tweaking individual vertices. So being able to jump in and use the grab tool and the smooth brush, the whole process becomes much, much faster. Now, something that I want to keep in mind while I'm modeling this character is that I intend to use a multi-res modifier at the end of this to sculpt in a lot of the higher frequency details. So I want to make sure that my polygons are really evenly distributed here, and by that I mean that they're all roughly kind of the same shape. So although there might be, you know, some smaller polygons as we, you know, get into the face area where there's higher detail, they're all still basically squares. You know, there's no stretched rectangular shapes. It can be extremely difficult to sculpt in these high details when the topology isn't even. Now, I have to apologize, I lost a little bit of the recording just about to come up. I paused the recording because I was changing my music and I forgot to turn the recording back on. So fortunately I only lost adding a few of these additional spikes kind of down the middle of the shell here, which you've already seen me do a few times, so hopefully there's no harm done. Now if you look closely while I create the mouth, you'll notice that I kind of mess up a little bit. I extrude the mouth inwards without first insetting the faces, so this now means that I don't have edge loops going around the outside of the mouth, which makes it really hard for adding mouth shapes later on. So in a moment you'll notice that I'll go in and I'll manually add those edge loops by hand. Now, Lapras has a really strangely shaped eye. In fact, I don't think it could actually exist in nature. So it's kind of got this triangular shape that would make it really difficult for the eyeball to be able to roll around in the socket. The eyes end up having to be really, really big, and you can see that they kind of penetrate in the middle of the head. I have to do some strange things with the eyeball to kind of get it to sit in the socket properly. There's a very good chance that I'll be redoing these eyes a little bit later on when I get to the rigging stage. You can see here as I'm working on the flippers, I start adding a few extra edge loops going down and then kind of shifting things around a little bit. This is mostly so that I can make sure that where I'm bridging the body to the flipper, I've got enough detail, but it also allows me to, again, make sure that I'm keeping those square polygons so that the sculpting will be easier later on. Now the horns here were a bit of a pain to make, mostly because at first I wasn't sure whether they were horns or whether they were ears. The way that they curl back on each other is really difficult because you can end up with a lot of geometry that kind of interpenetrates itself, and this can cause issues later on when you're creating displacement maps, so you really want to try and avoid this as much as possible. Here I create the interior of the mouth. Now the interior can be kind of a little bit annoying to create, mostly because it's really hard to see inside the mouth to be able to sculpt it. So I tend to create this little kind of mouth bag piece as a separate object to begin with, which makes it easier for me to be able to see and manipulate on its own. And then once I'm happy with the shapes, I join it back into the original mesh and bridge the gap between them. I try and keep a character's mouth open for as long as possible, again, because it's really hard to see inside there to be able to make changes. I try and close the mouth only once I'm really happy with how everything else is around the mouth is kind of turning out. And a little tip, once you've got the lips pretty close together, you can swap over to the inflate brush and then just kind of dabbing at that closes the lips. Here you can see I take another crack at doing the eye. This time I wasn't so worried about making the eye into a sphere so that it would be easier to rig later on. This time I just wanted to make sure that it was going to look good so that I could just kind of keep working. Now there's still a chance that I'm going to come back and replace this once again when I get to the rigging stage. I also really quickly add a hand-painted texture to it so that I can see the pupil and the iris. Both of these are kind of important to be able to see while you're sculpting, particularly around eyelids and such. It gives you a better feeling for how big the eye is. You can see here I try and play around with another idea for the horns, but I ultimately abandoned this as the little tube things that I've created earlier turn out to be better. I actually record these sculpts over several days. All up, this is around about 4 hours worth of work over 4 or 5 days. And I realize here that I forgot to save the eye texture from the previous day, so when I closed Blender, I lost it. So remember, Blender doesn't automatically save the textures you paint, you have to save them manually. And this isn't the first time this has caught me out. And here at long last, I'm happy with the overall shape of the mesh, and I add the multires modifier to begin sculpting in my higher frequency details. Now remember, once you start sculpting with the multires, it becomes really difficult to come back and make changes to the original mesh. It tends to break things. And then I almost immediately break my own rule. I realize that I've completely forgot to add the nostril holes, so I decide to test how robust the multires modifier is, and see if I can't add these extra edge loops in without breaking the modifier. Thankfully, because this was a relatively small change, the modifier continues to work, but I'd still really recommend staying away from large scale changes. Before you start sculpting, you should also remember to apply your transformations to all of your meshes. I actually forgot to do this on Lapras' body, and right near the end I suddenly realized that I've made that mistake. Thankfully I got really lucky, and although applying the transformations after I've done all of my sculpting does move the mesh a little bit, it's not enough to break everything. So here's where I start to take some creative liberties with the design. My plan is kind of to eventually 3D print this character, or at least to design it in such a way that I could print it. So I wanted to add a few extra, more realistic details to add some extra interest should I end up 3D printing it. So I had a lot of references of sea creatures, including like monsters designs from other artists, but specifically whales. So the flippers here, and you'll see later that the neck and belly are largely based on whale anatomy. Now this stage can be really difficult as you're kind of going from a relatively simple design, which works because, you know, everything is kind of simple, and then you start adding in some extra complexities such as wrinkles and folds. So this adds a lot of detail kind of in one area, which compared to the rest of the model, which is still simple, it can make it look unbalanced. So I felt really reluctant to add too much at this point, as it kind of felt like I was destroying the original design. But you've just kind of got to push through this, because once you get to a point of adding all the extra detail, like across the whole model, it suddenly falls into place and suddenly starts to look good. I was experimenting with a new add-on in this video. It's called the Brush Quickset by Vrav. It allows you to right-click and move the mouse either up or across to adjust both the strength and the size of the brush, so it's really quick. And it's a very handy add-on, but I also found that it meant that usually I have the right-click menu, and that allows me to bring up some additional brush settings like the pinch setting for the crease brush. And using this add-on, I lost some of that extra functionality, so I'm not sure if I'm going to keep using this, but it was very handy, so I will make sure that there is a link in the description if you guys want to go and check that out. I start to feel like the large sections of the body here are starting to lack a little bit of detail, so it's time to add Lapras' spots. So I use the spots that are on the reference to make a start, but I find that there's not quite enough of them with this more detailed version that I'm going for, so I end up adding quite a few more, and trying to keep those sort of sharp angles from the original design. So I mask out where I want all of these spots to be. I then invert the mask and I use the new mesh filter with the inflate setting to kind of pop these out from the original mesh. So this is where I start to add some of the more realistic details based upon my whale reference. The first thing I do is to create a line that separates the belly from the rest of the body. So I experiment both with indenting and extruding this area out. Ultimately, I decide to do a little bit of both. So initially I indent it, but then I kind of smooth my mask out and almost immediately extrude it back out. So this allows me to keep the basic volumes of the body while making this line that I want fairly pronounced. I spend way too much time on the lips here. I was hoping to add this sort of lizard-like scales around the mouth, and I think if I'd been trying to make something that was a lot more detailed, this probably would have worked, but it ends up being a lot of detail specifically around the lips and not as much around the rest of the body. So it draws your eye to the lips, which you don't really have a good reason to be focusing on the lips. So despite all the time that I spend on this, I actually end up completely smoothing this area out later. So since this is not going to end up in the final sculpt, let's fast forward through it. So because I'm really unhappy with how the lips are turning out right now, I choose to ignore them for a little bit and take some time to add a few extra spots to the flippers, which are starting to look a little bit under-detailed. It's perfectly okay to choose to leave an area for a little while. It allows you to go and work on something else for a bit, and then when you come back to it later, you can kind of look at it with fresh eyes. So I encourage you to kind of jump from one area to another, rather than sticking with one area and making sure that it's completely detailed up. This ability to look at things with fresh eyes can be really helpful for spotting mistakes, or even just giving your brain time to kind of think about it in the background and possibly come up with a solution. So I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do with these belly wrinkles, so rather than trying to sculpt them in directly, I choose to mask these areas out. So a little bit later on you'll see that this gives me the ability to kind of invert my mask back and forth and play with a couple of different directions before finally settling on a design. So here I finally decide that these little curly bits on the side of the head, I'm going to make them horns rather than ears. So I go in and add these kind of sharp edges to them, which makes them feel a little bit more bone-like and therefore more horn-like. It's here I realised that what's really bothering me about the lips is this straight line where the scales just kind of stop. It really needs to blend in with the rest of the head better, so I attempt to kind of make them blend using alphas. Look, this is definitely an improvement on where it was before, but it's still got a lot of this really heavy, deep detail which suddenly disappears into nothing on the rest of the face, so it still kind of looks really weird. I decided a little bit earlier on that I wanted to detail this shell up a little bit more, kind of make it look more like, say, a turtle shell with all these kind of hexagonal interconnecting bits. Now, with the way that the spikes are, the hexagons don't work perfectly, as in I'm not able to get everything in a hexagonal shape, which is a little bit annoying. So I spent a little bit of time with the crease brush here, just kind of lightly brushing in some general shapes to make sure that I've got something that feels appealing. And then I go back in with the mask brush, make these lines a little bit more crisp. And then, like we did with the wrinkles on the belly, I invert the mask and use the inflate brush, this time to push the geometry back in and make these a little bit more pronounced. I also wanted the shell to kind of have this a little bit of a rocky kind of texture to it. So I kind of go in and just bulge little areas out a little bit just to give it a little bit of texture. Around about here I realized that if I swap over from just the regular clay brush to the clay strips brush, I get this extra little bit of texturing detail, which I really like, so I kind of go back over it again, which helps give it this kind of rocky sort of feel. Then, like I did with the ears and the horn on the face, I go through and, again, using the crease brush inverted, add all of these extra lines in there, and again, this just kind of gives it this bone-like feeling, like it's got some hard edges to it. I experimented with adding some actual kind of rocky alpha maps to the shell, but I'm fairly happy with what the clay strips have done. It's this kind of more simplified feel to it, which I really like, and will probably look a little bit better once it's 3D printed, at least for the style I'm going for. What I do want to do is just go and add a little bit of like damage to the shell. So some little cuts and nicks and stuff, as if Lapras has been in a few too many Pokemon battles or something. And then I realised that, hey, I want to do that to the front horn because, it might be headbutting things or whatever, and similar kind of thing with the horns on the side of the head. It's around here that I realised that the body hasn't had its scale applied to it. Thankfully this has really little effect on the overall sculpt, but you will notice that it does mess up the tail pretty badly. So I got really lucky with this sculpt, but please make sure to apply your transformations before you begin sculpting. I finally get fed up with the lip details and choose to remove them. Personally, I think this improves the piece dramatically, because I don't think it needed all of that extra detail. Lapras has a certain beauty to it, and I think trying to add too much detail to the face was detracting from that. The eyes are still looking a little strange, and that's largely because I haven't added eyelids yet. This is a really common mistake. 2D images and cartoon designs, you can often get away with having very little or no eyelids at all, but 3D models almost always need them, otherwise you kind of get that creepy doll appearance. So I really should have added these earlier, as my sculpt is now getting really high polygon, and adding some of these extra details can become a little bit tricky. Thankfully, I figured out that the smooth brush by default is set to 0.5 or 50%, so if you select the brush directly, rather than just going to it by holding down Shift and auto smoothing, you can crank it all the way up to 100%, and that gave me a lot more smoothing power. I decided to add another fat roll under the shell here. I really wanted to give the impression that the shell has a lot of weight to it, and it's kind of pushing down on the back of Lapras, which is going to make all of this extra skin bunch up slightly. Right at the very end here, I start adding some really high frequency details using alphas. This part can be really fun because it allows you to add a stack of detail really quickly, but this only works if you've taken the time to sculpt in these kind of more mid-frequency details first. So all of these alpha wrinkles and such only work because I've hand sculpted the larger wrinkles in first. I give the eyes one last tweak because I thought it looked a little bit like Lapras was squinting too much, and then we're done with the sculpting. So hopefully you've learned a few things watching this video. In the next video, I'm going to be UV unwrapping and texturing this model, and I'll show you how to extract displacement maps and normal maps from this sculpt so that you can apply them to the lower resolution model. If you'd like to know when that video is released, you should totally subscribe to the channel. Until then,